The St. Lawrence River, November 1813. A rough, cold and wet wind blows across the gray water, bringing the first cold air of a terrible Canadian winter. On this water floats a huge fleet of boats, the largest American army of the entire war. A group of 7,000 people. They are packed into hundreds of regular boats, rafts, and captured boats. A floating city of soldiers in blue coats, volunteer fighters, and cannons, all drifting steadily toward one target, Montreal. This is the St. Lawrence Campaign, the big American risk of 1813, a two-part attack designed to deliver the final, war-winning hit. If Montreal falls, the main supply line of the British Empire in North America is cut. Upper Canada, which is modern-day Ontario, will be cut off, starved, and forced to give up. The war would be, for all reasons, over. At the head of this powerful force is Major General James Wilkinson. He is a man haunted by problems, a person known for being really bad at his job, and unknown to people around him, a paid spy for the Spanish government. Now he is a man sick with illness, directing this important campaign not from a horse, but from the comfort of his command boat. He is sick, and his army is tired of him. They have been floating for weeks, bothered by weather, sickness, and something else. A small, annoying, and constant shadow. This shadow is a British watching group, a tiny force of professional soldiers in red coats and Canadian volunteer fighters. It is a tiny bug on the lion's back, a constant sting in the rear of the great American beast. They are too few to fight, but too stubborn to ignore. As the American fleet travels through the dangerous salt rapids, this British group marching along the riverbanks snaps at their heels, picking off stragglers and burning supply dumps. For Major General Wilkinson, this annoyance has become unbearable. His men are losing confidence. The campaign is slowing down. The clock is ticking toward winter. He has 7,000 regular soldiers with parts of the 9th, 11th, and 25th U.S. Infantry. The force chasing his steps is a tiny fraction of that size. The time has come to turn and crush this chaser, to brush this annoying pest aside, so the real work of taking Montreal can begin. On the 10th of November, the decision is made. Wilkinson will land a large group of his regular soldiers to find, trap, and destroy the British. He gives the order to his second-in-command, Brigadier General John Parker Boyd. The Americans will make landfall, form for battle, and remind the British government what happens when it stands in the way of American destiny. They have the numbers, they have the guns, and they are on the edge of total victory. But the commander of the British force has been watching. He has been waiting, and he has already chosen the ground where this battle will be fought. It is a patch of flat, muddy, plowed farmland belonging to a man named John Crysler. It is a European-style battlefield. And it is here in the open that the fate of Canada will be decided. The odds are about to be set, roughly 2,500 Americans against 900 British and Canadians. The British force chasing Wilkinson's army was not a powerful army. In the grand math of war, it was barely worth counting, a mere 900 men. But these were not untrained new soldiers or untested volunteer fighters. They were for the most part some of the most disciplined and toughened professionals in the British Army, and they were led by a man who understood exactly what they were capable of. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Morrison was the complete opposite of his American opponent. Where Wilkinson was political, full of problems and sick, Morrison was a field soldier, professional, steady, and experienced. He was an officer of the 49th Regiment of Foot, and his small watching group was a small version of the British Empire's military machine, a group of English and Irish regular soldiers, helped by loyal Canadian volunteer fighters and First Nations allies. The backbone of his force, its very soul, was this 49th Regiment, the Green Tigers. They were a group with a reputation, toughened by campaigns in Europe, and now veterans of the grinding war in Canada. They numbered perhaps 400 strong. Alongside them stood the 89th Regiment of Foot, Blaze Bloodhounds, another 230 men of the line, equally disciplined and trained in the same tough style of musket shooting and the bayonet. This was the iron center of Morrison's line. But his flanks were made up of men fighting for their own homes. Roughly 180 men from the Canadian Fencibles and the famous Canadian Voltigas, a light infantry unit known for its sharp shooting and forest skills, protected his force. And with them, moving like ghosts through the trees, were some 30 Mohawk warriors, scouts and skirmishers, whose very presence struck a special fear into the American regular soldiers. Finally, to give his line a voice, Morrison had a small group of Royal Artillery with 2 light 6-pounder cannons. For weeks, Morrison's job had been one of harassment. He was to sting, to cut, to bleed the American giant, but never to fight it directly. He was to be a constant, weakening drain on Wilkinson's spirit and supplies. But on the morning of November 11, 1813, everything changed. The American fleet was pulling to shore. The boats were pouring out thousands of soldiers in blue coats. The tiny bug was no longer being swatted at. It was being hunted. The Americans were forming for a set battle. For a commander with such a huge difference in numbers, this should have been the moment to retreat, to disappear, and let the Americans continue their march, weakened but still together. But Joseph Morrison did not see a crisis. He saw an opportunity. He saw the American pride, their reliance on pure numbers, and he looked at the ground before him. He was at John Crysler's farm. It was not a fortress, not a ridge, not a natural strong point. It was the opposite. It was flat, open, plowed farmland. To an American commander like Boyd, it looked like a perfect place to use his larger numbers and simply walk over the thin British line. But to Morrison, it was a slice of Europe transported to the Canadian wilderness. It was a parade ground. It was a killing field, perfectly suited to the one thing his soldiers did better than any other army on earth: stand in a 2-deep line, deliver disciplined rolling volleys of musket fire, and charge with the bayonet. He anchored his line. His right flank was secured by the wide, icy St. Lawrence River. His left flank was tucked into a dense swampy wood, a tangle of trees and valleys that would be difficult for regular infantry to get through. He placed his Canadian and native allies in that wood. He placed his 2 6-pounder cannons in the center, and then he formed his 400 Green Tigers and his 200 Bloodhounds in a thin red line across the open muddy fields. They stood waiting, their shoulders touching. 900 men staring down an army and daring it to advance. On the banks of the St. Lawrence, the American war machine uncoiled. Brigadier General John Parker Boyd had his orders not from a fellow officer on horseback, but from his sick commander, Major General Wilkinson, who remained hidden on his command boat, a floating headquarters separated from the coming fight. The order was simple, unclear, and full of pride. Scatter the British force. It was the order one gives to swat a fly, not to fight a battle. But the force Boyd put together on the shore was no fly swatter. It was a hammer. He gathered approximately 2,500 United States regular soldiers. These were not the poorly trained volunteer fighters that had failed in other campaigns. These were the professionals of the U.S. Army. Parts of the 9th, 11th, 13th, 16th, 21st, and 25th U.S. Infantry regiments formed up. Their blue coats a sharp contrast to the dull, muddy fields. They were supported by a group of the 2nd U.S. Light Dragoons, their sabers and helmets with feathers, a promise of a final, crushing charge. And most importantly, they had more artillery. 4 6-pounder cannons, double the number of the British. John Parker Boyd was a man with a respectable fighting record, but he was now in a difficult position. He was the person giving orders while the person making overall plans remained floating on the river. He was expected to win and to win quickly. He looked at Morrison's line, a laughably thin red ribbon stretched across the farm. It was barely 900 men. Boyd had more infantry, cavalry, and artillery. The tactical problem seemed simple. His plan was a result of this overwhelming confidence. It would be a brute force attack, a display of American power designed to crush the British line in a single overwhelming push. He would not get into a subtle musket shooting duel, a game the British professionals were great at. He would use his numbers. The main attack would be delivered by his infantry groups formed not in lines but in deep heavy attack columns. This was a strategy borrowed from the Napoleonic Wars raging in Europe. The column was a human battering ram. It was deep and narrow, designed to build up speed and punch a hole straight through an enemy's line with a bayonet. Its weakness, however, was its lack of firepower. In a column hundreds of men deep, only the first few rows could actually aim and fire their weapons. The rest were just weight pushing from behind. Boyd was gambling that he wouldn't need firepower. He was betting that the pure fear of his columns combined with their numbers would be enough to break the thin red line before a shot was even fired. To prepare the way, he would first send a group of light infantry to clear the swampy woods on the British left. He needed to secure his own flank and unhinge the British line before the main event. Once the flank was cleared, his columns would advance, supported by their 4 cannons, and simply walk over the 49th and 89th regiments. The 2nd Dragoons would be held in reserve, ready to charge into the gap and turn the British retreat into a complete defeat. It was a solid, normal plan. It was by any military textbook of the time the correct way for a larger force to attack a smaller one. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon on November 11, 1813, the American drums began to beat the advance. The cold, damp air filled with the shuffling sound of thousands of boots slogging through the plowed mud. The great blue tide began to roll forward. A wave of men and steel aimed at the heart of the 900-man line that stood silently waiting and watching. The battle for Chrysler's farm did not begin with the crash of musket volleys or the thunder of a cavalry charge. It began, as so many battles of this time did, with a messy, desperate fight on the edge. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the raw November air was about to be torn apart. Brigadier General Boyd's first move was to secure his right flank. He could not or would not send his main columns forward while Morrison's left was still in the air. Anchored by that dense, swampy wood, he sent a strong group of American light infantry. Regular soldiers trained to fight in a more open order than the line infantry. With the clear mission of clearing that forest, they were to jump into the trees, flush out the skirmishers they saw moving between them, and unhinge the entire British position. The Americans advanced with grim determination, their blue coats disappearing into the gloom of the tangled leafless trees. They were walking into a different kind of war. This was not the open plowed field, but a landscape of sucking mud, thick undergrowth, and a deep, dangerous valley that cut through the wood. It was a terrain that cancelled out their numbers and their normal training. And it was a terrain perfectly suited to the men who were waiting for them. They were not redcoats. They were the Canadian Voltigas and the 30 Mohawk warriors. The Voltigas, in their grey uniforms, were elite light infantry recruited from the French-Canadian people. They were superb marksmen, comfortable in this broken terrain, and they were fighting to protect their own homes from an invading army. With them were the Mohawks, masters of this woodland warfare, their presence a fear weapon as much as a physical one. The woods erupted. The sound was different here. Not the organized crash of a battalion, but the sharp, irregular crack of individual muskets. The Voltigas and Mohawks did not stand in a line. They fought from behind trees from the edge of the valley, firing, reloading, and moving. The American light infantry pushed forward, expecting to brush aside a few volunteer fighters, and instead found themselves in a deadly close-quarters fight. The fight centered on the valley. The Americans tried to push through it to remove the defenders. They would form a rush only to be met by a well-aimed shot from a hidden marksman. The air filled with the strong sulphurous smell of black powder, a smell that stuck to the damp trees and mixed with the scent of wet earth. Officers shouted orders that were swallowed by the leaves. Men slipped in the mud, struggling for footing as they tried to aim and reload their long flintlock muskets. This was a sharp fight in the truest sense of the word. It was personal, brutal, and chaotic. But the Canadians and their Mohawk allies would not be moved. They knew this ground. They were fighting on their own terms. The American light infantry, for all their bravery, were a normal force trying to solve an unusual problem. They could not get close to an enemy that refused to stand still, an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. They were held off. The American attack stalled, stuck in the mud and trees. They had failed to clear the flank. They had failed to unhinge Morrison's line. And this failure was important because as this fierce skirmish raged and sputtered on the left, the main event was beginning. It was now 2 In the center of the field, the great American columns, the human battering rams, had begun their slow, heavy advance across the open plowed ground. The real battle was about to be joined. While the Canadian Voltigas and Mohawks held the American right flank in a bloody stalemate in the woods, the true test of arms began on the open plowed fields of Chrysler's farm. It was here that Brigadier General Boyd's main idea of the battle would be tested. His heavy infantry columns, thousands of men deep, were now in motion. This was a sight of 19th-century warfare, a vision of raw moving power. The American columns, made up of parts from multiple U.S. infantry regiments, moved forward with a grim determination. They were a mass of blue, a solid block of people designed to crash through the impossibly thin line of red. Their own 4 6-pounder cannons opened fire, sending iron-round shots screaming over the field, attempting to soften the British line. The sound was a deep, echoing boom that bounced off the river. In the British center, the 600 men of the 49th and 89th regiments stood silent. They were not moving. They were not firing. They were simply waiting. This was the core of their training, a discipline drilled into them on parade grounds 1,000 miles away, and now being put to the ultimate test. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a line just 2 men deep. Every soldier could see the field. Every soldier had a clear shot. They were in effect a 600-gun battery waiting for a single command. The British Royal Artillery with their 2 6-pounders replied to the American shooting. They were expertly served. At a distance, they fired solid iron balls, round shot that skipped across the muddy field, tearing bloody lanes through the deep American columns. As the Americans moved closer, slogging through the thick, wet plow soil that exhausted the men and ruined their formations, the British artillerymen changed their ammunition. They loaded canister shot. These were simple tin cans packed with dozens of smaller musket-sized lead balls. When fired, the cannons became enormous shotguns, blasting a wide, devastating cone of metal into the packed rows of the advancing infantry. The American columns wavered, but they did not break. They were regular soldiers, and they closed ranks, stepping over the fallen, and kept coming. They were now inside 100 yards. The British line was a blur of red coats and white cross belts. The officers of the 49th and 89th watched, their swords drawn, waiting for the exact perfect moment. The Americans, in their deep columns, raised their muskets, but only the first few rows could effectively fire. They let loose a rough volley that whistled largely over the heads of the redcoats. And then the order came, make ready, present, fire. The sound was not a pop or a crack. It was a crash. 600 Brown Bess muskets all firing as one. A single rolling clap of thunder that was louder than the sound of the artillery. A solid sheet of flame and thick white strong smoke erupted from the entire length of the British line. This was the wall of lead. The front rows of the American columns were destroyed. The 1-ounce lead balls from the .75 caliber muskets were devastating at this range. Men were thrown backwards as if hit by a hammer. The speed of the entire attack, the physical and mental weight of the columns stopped dead. Before the Americans could recover, the British regular soldiers were reloading. This was the machine-like precision that won battles. They were trained to load and fire 3, even 4 times a minute. Reload. Make ready. Present. Fire. Another rolling volley crashed into the stunned Americans, and then another. The American columns, designed to be a battering ram, had failed to break the line. Now they were just a dense, perfect target. A mass of men unable to spread into their own line to fire back effectively. They were trapped, absorbing volley after volley. Their attack broken, their rows falling apart into a disorganized and terrified mob. The American attack was not just broken. It was falling apart. The great infantry columns that were meant to be an unstoppable wave had crashed against the red brick wall of the 49th and 89th, and were now flowing back. A confused mass of shocked and demoralized men. The air was so thick with white sulphurous smoke that the battlefield was becoming a ghostly landscape, a scene of phantoms appearing and disappearing through the fog of war. Through this smoke, Brigadier General John Parker Boyd saw his plan collapsing. His infantry was shattered. His flank attack in the woods was a stalemate. He had one card left to play, one arm of his force, yet unused. He had his shock troops, his finishers, the 2nd U.S. Light Dragoons. This was the moment of desperation. Infantry had failed. Perhaps cavalry could succeed. A bugle call cut through the noise of musket fire and the screams of the wounded. The U.S. Dragoons with their helmets with feathers and drawn sabers began to move. This was what they were trained for, to charge a broken and wavering enemy line, to crash into its flank, and to turn a retreat into a complete defeat. They formed up and began their advance. First a trot, then a canter, then an all-out charge. Hoofs thundering on the wet muddy ground aimed directly at the heart of the British line, the 49th Regiment. For infantry in a two-deep line, a cavalry charge was the ultimate nightmare. Sabers and horses held a terrifying advantage over a man on foot. The standard response was a drill book move. Form square. The line would fold in on itself, creating a four-sided fortress of men, a bristling fortress of bayonets that no horse would dare charge. But in the chaos of battle, with strong smoke stinging the eyes and the ground shaking from the charge, this was the hardest test of discipline a soldier could face. It is unclear if the 49th had time to form a perfect square. What is clear is that they did not run. They stood fast. Whether in a full square or simply remaining in their magnificent, unbroken line, the Green Tigers showed a courage that seemed superhuman. They let the dragoons come. The thunder of the charge grew, the shouts of the horsemen now hearable, the glint of steel visible through the smoke. They were closing the distance. 50 yards, 30 yards. The sergeants roared the order. Another volley, perfectly timed, tore into the front row of the charge at point-blank range. This volley was not aimed at the men, but at the horses. It was a brutal, devastating tactic. Horses screamed and tumbled, crashing into the men behind them, creating a horrific, tangled pileup of men and animals. The American cavalry charge dissolved in an instant. Saddles were emptied. The speed was completely broken. The few dragoons who survived the volley pulled back their terrified mounts, turned and fled the field. The British line had held. It had been attacked by infantry columns, battered by artillery, and now charged by cavalry. It had not bent, and it had not broken. The 49th and 89th regiments had pushed back every single thing the American army had thrown at them. The tactical battle was, in this moment, effectively over. The Americans had no more reserves to use. Their army was a spent force. And now the initiative was about to change hands. The battle for a moment hung in a dreadful smoky pause. The last American cavalryman had fled. The American infantry, those brave regular soldiers who had marched so confidently into the storm, were now a milling, disorganized mass. They were no longer columns. They were crowds. They had absorbed devastating point-blank volleys. They had seen their cavalry shattered. Their officers were desperately trying to reform them to put in some order. But the men's spirit was broken. They were a body without a head. Their commander-in-chief still on his boat, and their field commander Boyd having lost all control of the fight. Through the drifting clouds of white smoke, the British line remained. It was scarred. It had taken casualties, but it was unbroken. It stood in the same two-deep formation it had held all afternoon, a thin red wall of men and steel. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Morrison, watching from horseback, saw the critical moment arrive. He had pushed them back. He had absorbed the very worst a larger force could throw at him. But battles are not won by standing still. They are won by breaking the enemy's will to fight. And he saw that the American will was now hanging by a thread. The order was given. It rippled down the line from Morrison to his officers, from the officers to their sergeants. The line will advance. Fix bayonets. The sound was a sharp metallic shing click, repeated 600 times as 617-inch spikes of polished steel were locked onto the muzzles of 600 Brown Bess muskets. This was the weapon of decision. It was not a tool for killing at a distance. It was a fierce spearhead, a symbol of absolute terrifying intent. Then the second order, forward, march, and the entire line from the riverbank to the edge of the woods moved. It was the most awe-inspiring and dreadful sight on a battlefield of the time. It was not a chaotic rush. It was a disciplined, steady advance. The 49th and 89th regiments, their lines dressed as if on a parade ground, stepped off as one. They moved at a walk, a relentless, unstoppable red tide. Their bayonets glittering, their boots churning the muddy, blood-soaked plow soil. They advanced directly into the remaining clouds of smoke, a wall of disciplined fury. As they moved, a sound began to build. A deep-throated, rhythmic roar from 600 chests. Huzzah! 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 This was not a scream of desperation. It was the unified triumphant cry of the British infantry, a sound that had echoed on fields from Spain to India. And now it was being heard in the heart of Canada. For the American regular soldiers, this was the final unimaginable terror. They had braved the canister. They had marched into the volleys, but they had done so believing they were the attackers. Now the force they had failed to break, the line they had outnumbered 3-1, was advancing on them. The psychological snap was instant and total. The sight of that steady bayonet-tipped wall, emerging from the smoke combined with the terrifying roar of the huzzah was more than any soldier could bear. Panic, the great contagion of every battlefield, took hold. Men who had stood bravely just minutes before now threw down their muskets, their equipment, and ran. Officers shouted, begged, and threatened. But it was useless. The last bits of unity evaporated. The American army stopped being an army. It became a terrified mob, streaming back towards the river, slogging in desperation through the same muddy fields they had so confidently advanced across just 2 hours earlier. The defeat was total. The battle was over. By 4 in the afternoon, the dreadful noise of battle had stopped. The rolling thunder of the volleys, the deep boom of the 6-pounders, and the climactic, terrifying huzzah of the charge, all of it was gone. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavy and deep, broken only by the groans of the wounded, the distant, panicked shouts of the retreating Americans, and the barked orders of British sergeants reforming their companies. The 900 men of Morrison's group stood victorious on the field of Crysler's farm. They did not chase the Americans all the way to their boats. Their job was done, their numbers too few for a reckless chase. They simply held the ground they had so bloodily defended. As the thick white sulphurous smoke from thousands of black powder explosions began to clear, blown away by the raw November wind, the true cost of the battle was revealed. The killing ground that Morrison had chosen was now a scene of shocking death. The flat, open, plowed fields were no longer just mud. They were a swamp of earth, water, and blood, churned by the boots of thousands of men and the hooves of the charging cavalry. The air, no longer stinging with the harsh smell of gunpowder, was now heavy with the metallic smell of blood and the scent of damp earth. The ground was littered with the remains of a broken army. Hundreds of discarded American Springfield 1795 muskets dropped in the panic of the defeat. Canteens, backpacks, and the helmets with feathers of the dragoons. And everywhere there were the men, the blue-coated American regular soldiers, who had advanced with such bravery, now lay in heaps and scattered lines where the British volleys had found them. The ground in front of the 49th and 89th was a testament to their fire discipline, a grim picture of the price paid for attacking a steady line. The American columns had been so dense, the volleys so devastating that the dead lay in rows as if mowed down by a scythe. But the most horrific sight on the field was the wreckage of the 2nd U.S. Light Dragoons charge. Here the ground was a tangled grotesque sculpture of dead and dying horses, their bodies twisted in pain, piled on top of their fallen riders. It was a stark, brutal monument to the futility of sending cavalry against unbroken, disciplined infantry. The British regular soldiers, the Green Tigers, and the Blaze Bloodhounds stood among this. They were exhausted, their faces blackened with powder, their red coats stained with mud and sweat. They had taken casualties, but they had caused a catastrophe. They had held the line. They had won the field. And as the cold, damp evening began to settle over the St. Lawrence, the strategic reality of what these 900 men had just accomplished began to sink in. They hadn't just defeated a detachment. They had broken an army. The chaos of the defeat did not stop at the riverbank. It was a contagion that spread back to the main American fleet. The 7,000 men who had waited on their boats, listening to the battle rage just out of sight, now watched in horror as the first of their comrades, the detachment of 2,500 regular soldiers, came streaming back. They were not victorious. They were a terrified, beaten mob, slogging through the shallows, throwing themselves into the boats, their unity and spirit completely shattered. They brought with them the story of what had happened on that farm. They told of the thin red line that would not break, of the rolling thunder of the British volleys, of the horrifying canister shot, of the failed cavalry charge, and finally of the forest of bayonets that had advanced from the smoke. The watching group, the annoyance they were sent to scatter, had broken them. The mental shock rippled through the entire army. If 900 British regular soldiers could do this to 2,500 American regular soldiers, what hope was there of taking the actual fortress of Montreal? On his command boat, Major General James Wilkinson, still sick, received the news of Brigadier General Boyd's defeat. It was a tactical catastrophe. The force he had thought was a mere irritant had just handed his professionals a stunning and humiliating defeat. But the day's bad news were not yet complete. As his army reeled from this physical and mental blow, another messenger arrived, bringing news that was, if possible, even worse. This campaign had been a two-part pincer. While Wilkinson's army of 7,000 descended the St. Lawrence, another American army under General Wade Hampton was supposed to have advanced north from Lake Champlain to join him before Montreal. The news that now reached Wilkinson was that this other pincer was gone. On October 26, weeks earlier, General Hampton's force had been defeated at the Battle of the Chateauguay. And who had defeated him? Not an army of British regular soldiers, but a far smaller force made up almost entirely of French-Canadian volunteer fighters. The very people the Americans had thought would join them as liberators. The strategic situation had collapsed. Wilkinson was now alone. The southern pincer of his grand attack had been broken by volunteer fighters. His own northern pincer, his main army, had just been tactically checkmated and mentally shattered by a force it outnumbered almost 8-1. He was deep in enemy territory. The path to Montreal was not clear. It was now blocked by a small but provenly unbeatable group of British regular soldiers. And the Canadian winter, a foe more deadly than any army, was closing in. For Major General James Wilkinson, the controversial, ineffective, and now deeply compromised commander, there was only one choice left. The grand risk was over. The St. Lawrence campaign was a failure. That evening, as the first flakes of snow may have begun to fall, he gave the order. The fleet would not continue to Montreal. The entire 7,000-man army was to abandon the invasion, cross the river, and move into winter quarters at French Mills in New York. The war-winning blow had been blocked. The invasion of Canada had been stopped cold. The Battle of Chrysler's Farm was over. The grand American invasion of 1813 was dead. The question that echoed down the St. Lawrence and would soon echo in the halls of Washington was how. How had a force of 7,000 spear-headed by 2,500 regular soldiers been so completely humiliated by a mere 900? The answer was not a miracle. It was a brutal, cold, and professional calculation of tactics, terrain, and above all, discipline. This was Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Morrison's masterpiece. He was the architect of the victory before the first shot was ever fired. He had chosen the battlefield. When he saw the open, flat-plowed fields of Chrysler's Farm, he recognized a killing ground. He knew the American tendency, like the French in Europe, was to favor the attack column, a dense formation built for shock and speed. And he knew that such a column, when put against a steady line on open ground, was not a battering ram, but a coffin. The American commanders, Wilkinson and Boyd, had walked straight into his trap. They possessed all the advantages, men, cannon, and cavalry. But they were crippled by a fatal combination of pride and incompetence. Wilkinson, the strategic head, was physically and mentally absent, issuing unclear commands from a sick bed on his boat. Boyd, the tactical hand, was left to manage a battle he did not understand. He had no unity. He attacked in uncoordinated piecemeal fashion. He sent his light infantry into the woods as a separate, isolated fight. He then launched his main infantry columns unsupported. When they failed, he launched his cavalry in a desperate, unsupported charge. He fed his army into the British meat grinder, one piece at a time. On the British side, there was only unity. There was only the line. This battle was the ultimate proof of the thin red line tactic. Morrison's two-deep formation, stretching across the field, was a machine of maximum firepower. Every single one of his 600 regular soldiers in the 49th and 89th regiments could present his musket and fire. The American columns, by contrast, were all weight and no fire, as one person at the time described it. Only the front few rows of their deep formations could shoot, while the entire mass of men behind them served only to make the target larger and more densely packed. And then there was the discipline. This was the invisible force that truly won the day. The British regular soldiers were trained to stand. They were trained to endure canister shot and artillery fire without flinching. They were trained to hold their fire, to resist the natural urge to shoot at a distant target. They waited, their Brown Bess muskets loaded with a 1-ounce .75 caliber ball until the American columns were at close range under 100 yards. Only then was the order given. The rolling volleys fired as one were not just a rain of lead. They were a single catastrophic mental event. The wall of lead was unstoppable. The 6-pounder cannons, switching from solid round shot to canister, acted as giant shotguns, ripping bloody holes in the American formations. When the American cavalry charged, the 49th Green Tigers stood their ground, their volleys shattering the charge. And finally, when the American spirit was broken, it was the disciplined, unified advance with the bayonet, the huzzah, that turned a defeat into a complete defeat. Chrysler's Farm was not a fluke. It was a textbook, a brutal lesson in 19th-century warfare. A small, professional, well-led force on ground of its own choosing will always defeat a larger, poorly led crowd, no matter how brave its individual soldiers may be. The consequences of the disaster at Chrysler's Farm were immediate, deep, and strategic. This was not merely a tactical victory, a single defeat on a forgotten field. This was the decisive moment of the entire Northern campaign. This, in combination with the victory at Chateauguay, was the battle that saved Canada. The American plan of 1813 had been sound in concept. A two-part attack to seize Montreal, the strategic heart of British North America, was the correct move. Had it succeeded, Upper Canada would have withered on the vine. The 7,000-man army under Wilkinson, combined with Hampton's 4,000-man army, represented the single greatest concentration of American military power in the entire war. It was an all-in gamble, and it had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. The true importance of Chrysler's Farm is that it was the final fatal blow to this campaign. The Battle of the Chateauguay, on October 26, had been the first. There a small force of a few hundred French-Canadian volunteer fighters and voltigas under Lieutenant Colonel Charles de Salaberry had expertly used the terrain of a forested riverbank to turn back Wade Hampton's entire 4,000-man army. It was a humiliating defeat, proving that the Canadian people were not in fact waiting to be liberated by the Americans. But Hampton's defeat, while serious, was not fatal. The main effort, the 7,000-man fleet under Wilkinson, was still in play. It was this force, this great beast descending the St. Lawrence, that held the true potential to capture Montreal. The city was in a panic, its defenses weak. If Wilkinson had simply bypassed Morrison, absorbed the harassment, and pushed on, he might very well have succeeded. But he didn't. His pride and his underestimation of his foe was his downfall. He chose to stop. He chose to turn and fight. He believed he could swat aside the 900 men of Morrison's watching group. And in that 2-hour span, on the afternoon of November 11th, that tiny group of British professionals did what the rest of the British High Command had thought impossible. They stopped the entire invasion cold. The victory at Chrysler's Farm was a mental one as much as a physical one. It didn't just kill American soldiers. It killed the American army's will to fight. It broke their spirit. The news of the two defeats, Chateauguay and Chrysler's Farm, hitting Wilkinson at the same time, was a 1-2 punch that shattered the entire campaign. The two prongs of the pincer had been broken independently by two vastly smaller forces. For the British Empire and for the people of Canada, it was a moment of deep deliverance. Montreal was safe. Upper Canada was secure. The American attempt to conquer its northern neighbor in 1813 was over, and it had been achieved not by great armies, but by the grit of a few. It cemented the legend of the Red Coat Professional, the Green Tigers of the 49th, and the Bloodhounds of the 89th. Their performance on that muddy field became a textbook example of fire discipline and the power of the bayonet. And it elevated the Canadian Voltigas and volunteer fighters who had proven in the woods of Chateauguay and the valleys of Chrysler's Farm that they would fight and fight expertly to defend their own soil. The war would drag on, but never again would the Americans come so close to a war-winning victory. The back of the invasion had been broken. In the immediate aftermath, the American army dissolved. Wilkinson's 7,000-man force, now a demoralized and disease-ridden mob, huddled in their miserable winter quarters at French Mills, New York. They were a broken instrument, their grand attack having resulted in nothing but death and disgrace. The man who had led them, Major General James Wilkinson, would face a military trial for his staggering incompetence. In a final act that captured his career, he managed to secure an acquittal, but his reputation was destroyed. He would be remembered not as a conqueror, but as a fool and a traitor, a man who led the largest American army of the war to its most humiliating defeat. For Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Morrison, the story was different. He and his 900 men were celebrated as the saviors of Canada. The 49th and 89th Regiments, the Green Tigers and the Bloodhounds, had proven that the discipline of the British regular soldier was the single most powerful weapon on the North American continent. They, along with the Canadian Fencibles, Voltigas, and their Mohawk allies, had done the impossible. They had held the line. Chrysler's Farm would be embroidered on their regimental colors. A battle honor meaning a victory against overwhelming odds. A triumph of pure stubborn professionalism for the young nation of Canada. The victory was more than strategic. It was foundational. Chrysler's Farm and its sister battle at Chateauguay became part of a national story. It was a story of survival against a giant, a tale of a diverse people, British, French Canadian, and First Nations, uniting under the Crown to defend their homes. This brutal 2-hour fight in a muddy field was a crucible forging a distinct sense of self, a Canadian identity born not of peaceful separation, but of trial by fire. It was a declaration that Canada would not and could not be absorbed by its southern neighbor. The border, which had been so fluid and uncertain, was now being drawn in blood and steel. Today the battlefield of Chrysler's Farm is gone. The flat, open plowed fields where the 49th stood. The valleys where the Voltigas fought. The banks where the Americans landed. All of it now lies buried silent beneath the deep cold waters of the St. Lawrence Seaway. A massive 20th-century engineering project that rerouted the river and flooded the farm. But the memory is not drowned. On the new shoreline, a monument stands, a stone marker overlooking the water. It marks the place where a line of 900 men, outnumbered and outgunned, refused to break. It is a quiet testament to the battle that saved a nation, a reminder that the fate of a continent can turn on the courage of a few, and that the history of North America was written not just by politicians, but by the fire, the smoke, and the disciplined, terrifying advance of the Thin Red Line. Thanks for watching. If you found this story interesting, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. We'll see you in the next.